There's a wonderful reveal you get when you walk towards the sea, a bay, shoreline, which I'm doing right now. Actually, let me get a picture. There's a seat that just looks out towards the sea. Where are we? A lonely seat. F64, shutter speed 6/40th, ISO 160. And the seat, the top of the seat, is aligning with the horizon. I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or not. Well, it's not dissecting the horizon. That's usually where you get in trouble, isn't it? With people anyway, when you're photographing them. Oh, look, that horizon cuts the person off in their midriff. There we go. Sound of the sea. Great way to start this week's show. It's the first of 2 editions whilst I'm away with our photo walkers in Scotland. I'm going to be playing back some of the best moments from our shows from the last few years. Well, best ofs that I've compiled anyway. Best of being a bit of a subjective thing, but anyway, delving into the archive a little. And I'll come to the inspiration for today's topic or show in a moment or 3. But while I remember, and because this just can't wait until I'm back, I do want to share a comment that came into the show following the recent edition number 446, the show called Vulnerability is Your Superpower. First up, a hearty thank you, because I don't do this publicly enough, for your comments that you leave on the show pages after episodes. Sincerely, thank you. I answer every single one that comes in because I do see every one that comes in. They pop up on my phone like a reminder that our community is walking at all hours of the day and night around this beautiful planet. And this one, certainly, from the vulnerability episode, it piqued my curiosity, as they say. It came in from a photo walker called Anders, from somewhere in the world, and it read, "Hello Neil, how do you feel about the philosophical question that all pictures are already taken?" And then he left a link to a wonderful short film on YouTube. It's only a couple of minutes long, and it's called The Fear That Everything Has Already Been Done. And it's on a channel, this is a fantastic channel, it's called The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, and it's hosted by John Koenig. I'll link to this film and his channel on the show page today. This is one of the most wondrous channels I think I've ever seen. Where's it been all my life? A compendium of invented words written by John Koenig that aims to fill holes in the language, to give a name to emotions we all feel but don't have a word for. This channel is a real thinkers YouTube channel. It's a humanities channel. It's beautifully, photographically and cinematically edited and presented. It's like Sean Tucker on steroids, to bring the whole thing back to my colloquial base level. My choice of words, that is, certainly not Sean's. Suffice to say that John Koenig is exactly the sort of writer I'd like to be one day when I grow up. Anyway, thanks for the very good and varied content, says Anders. Always something new to realise and learn. First of all, Anders, very generous of you, on 2 counts, your kind words in your short message, but most importantly for sharing John's channel with me, which I guess as a project has sort of done its thing because it hasn't been posted on for quite a while. But in less than 40 films, it amassed 300,000 followers or so, who I'm sure are all the richer for having watched these short films about life, creativity, humanity, and vulnerability. I'm not sure, Anders, I'm as philosophically armed as I'd like to be with the right answer and thoughts to your question about whether every picture really has been taken and that nothing is necessarily new. I'd have to think about that for a long time on a desert island in a darkened corner somewhere. But I will say this, a minute into the film, while a whole bunch of pictures pass by our eyes, perfectly in sync with the changes of notes in the musical score, featuring top-down photos made on phones by people taking pictures of the pattern in a cup of cappuccino, that these words particularly resonated with me. It should be a comfort that we're not so different, that our perspectives so neatly align, that these images of the coffee keep showing up again and again and again. It's all right if we tell the same jokes that we've heard before. It's all right if we keep making the same movies. It's all right if we keep saying the same phrases to each other. The powerful play goes on, and you will contribute a verse. You and I and 7 billion others will leave our mark on this world we've inherited. See what I mean? I'll not read any more because I'd like you to click on the film on the show page, but it rang true because what we make, it really is unique to us, even if it's done or been done 1,000, 100,000, 1 million times before. Like fingerprints, Anders, this is about as philosophical as I get, by the way. Our pictures may be similar, but they'll never be the same because we made them and they're about us. And somebody else's picture of I don't know, a leaning Tower of Pisa, or the wingtip of an aircraft that you've taken out the window at seat 16A, or a cup of cappuccino, you know, the pattern left in one. Other people's pictures of those things, they'll never be ours. And it doesn't matter. And that's a good thing. So yeah, what a film, and what a thought. And I've used up all my introduction time, so I'll just have to tell you what and why we're doing what we're doing on the show today in a moment. Although I will say this, we're celebrating the work today of some extraordinary women who have left their indelible creative marks on this world with their cameras and their storytelling. Welcome along as we make our photo walks together, a show where we walk and make pictures, photographically sketchbooking our time together each week, listening back to special conversations with guests from around the world. And it's all made possible by our Patreon members, who I call Extra Milers, and of course, MPB. I am a very happy user, personally, of MPB. They've been supporting us now since pretty much the start of the show. And of course, I'm really grateful for that, and grateful for the support that you give MPB as well, with your trust. The largest global platform to buy, sell and trade in used photo and video gear, that's MPB, committed to making gear more accessible and more affordable, recirculating 570,000 cameras and lenses a year, extending the life and creative potential of visual storytelling gear. There's another thing that I think's really important, and I'll say this for a couple of weeks, that's customer service. And MPB are known for their first-class customer service. You can receive support through their help centre, or you can speak to an expert over the phone or via live chat. Hang about, Neil. Did you say speak to a person? Yes, I did. A real person? Yes, I did. Yeah, an actual person that knows stuff about cameras, and yes, I did. I did. MPB is not a marketplace. They buy directly from visual storytellers and evaluate all items before reselling MPB-approved kit. Put simply, they are the largest global platform to buy, sell and trade used photo and video kit. A simple, safe and circular way to trade, upgrade and get paid for kit. Together, let's change the bigger picture, put camera gear in more hands and keep the story going. Buy, sell, trade, create. Go to mpb.com/change. 2 weeks of best of specials while I'm in Scotland, walking the glens with our wonderful photo walkers. Though advance notice for Friday 27th, it'll be the Scottish Retreat edition, where you get to hear what we got up to, a flavour of Scotland on the 27th. Right, let's start this week's edition. Shall we walk? Checklist out. Coffee. Check. Garibaldi's. Check. Walking boots. Check. SD cards or a spare roll of film. Check. Well, let's walk. Actually, there was another item I should have thought about adding to the checklist today, and that's vulnerability. Or perhaps slight concern that I ensure the tone of what I'm about to say doesn't relegate me to the list of people who have appeared, sounded or actually are/do come across as condescending, God forbid, patronising. That is a long item to add to a checklist. But I hope you'll understand what I mean by it over the next few minutes when I share some thoughts. My other listener is already looking over the rim of the spectacles at me. Let me start with recalling the work of the late Tom Stoddart. who'll set up what I'm about to discuss with you. I like to think in the short time that I was lucky enough to know Tom, dear Tom, he became, I hope, a friend. And in many ways, though he didn't officially take on the role, a mentor. He certainly became a guiding conversational light in the early days of this show when it came to understanding the role of photojournalism and photojournalists. Tom was a brilliant British photojournalist, known for capturing some of the most powerful moments in humanitarian crises and conflicts. Not an easy job, and one that came with its own personal toll, as I think we discussed on the show a good few times. One of his most famous images is from the Bosnian War. It shows a woman walking defiantly through some ruins of Sarajevo in 1992. He also covered the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Africa, and he told these incredibly moving stories calmly and respectfully, and I think with a great amount of dignity afforded to anyone and everyone who came into contact with his lens. But not long before dear Tom Stoddart passed away in 2021, he published a book called Extraordinary Women, and it features that picture from Sarajevo I was just talking about. And we recorded our final chat together where he talked of why he'd made this book. And let me read a few lines from the introduction, which was written by Robin Morgan, who was editor-in-chief at the Sunday Times for almost 2 decades. Four paragraphs, if you'll allow me. Robin wrote, "We recognise great photojournalists by their signature images. Robert Capa's Spanish Civil War death of a loyalist, Don McCullin's frozen-faced US Marine. And we recognise Tom Stoddart's images through his subjects' humanity. It's their story he wants told. It's their lives he wants chronicled, recognised, rewarded with our appreciation, our awareness that our voices may be raised in their defence." And in this book, where Tom's story comes into sharp and unique focus, reaffirming the inconvenient truth, during the tectonic convulsions that rip landscapes to shreds, be they earthquake, famine or war, it's always the women and their children who bear the burden of calamity. It's their faces that tell the story and remind us we might be the next casualties of this disorder. But this is not a book about death, writes Robin, or horror or terror. Where others see only violence and despair, Tom Stoddart sees courage, defiance and endurance. Where others see only frailty and tears, Tom finds strength and dignity. Where others recall women as victims, Tom captures their fortitude. For this book is the story of extraordinary women. So that's from the introduction, Robin's words about an extraordinary book about extraordinary women. And the reason I want to ensure the tonality of my opening thoughts is well guided before I retire behind a tree just over there and listen along with you, so to speak, is that I'm completely aware of the fact even separating gender out in conversation can come across as somewhat condescending. Yeah, it does bother me, actually. Because we can and do, unlike, say, on the field of sports, perform our chosen professions together. Our eyes are all equal. Gender, in all its forms, is irrelevant, you could say, and so shining a spotlight, as I am within this show, on extraordinary women could be a tightrope that I hope isn't stretched beyond balance point. There's a wonderful line, it really is, from the forthcoming film about Lee Miller, called Lee, simply Lee. To demonstrate the attitude at the time, and many will rightly answer years before and years after, there is a line from the trailer which I will include on the show page, this trailer that is, and whether it was a word-for-word encounter or not, I suspect it's certainly part of the brick wall that the army tried to cement before Lee Miller. A major, or whatever rank he was, stops Lee Miller, played, I understand, brilliantly by Kate Winslet. He stops her as she tries to go about her work with a camera. And he says, "We don't send women into conflict." To which she answers, "Well, that's a problem, because I'm here." So This today is one of two specials whilst I'm away on the Photowalk Retreat in Scotland, where I get to return to some moments from shows in what I now refer to affectionately as our archive, which makes me feel very grown up. And I do refer to it as our archive. It's another place of retreat, I think, this archive, a place to go and learn about photographers and the people they photograph. And today, those photographers are the extraordinary women that I've had the absolute privilege of meeting and talking with. I'd like to play you more than just a segment of each, as we've done so before when we've had our best of episodes. I'd like to play you pretty much their entire conversations, which does mean I can't feature more than just a handful. Otherwise, this could end up a podcast that would equal in duration even the longest of long form. So let me start by introducing Nancy Borowick, an American artist, a photographer and an author. I like to think that with each interview I record, that I will take from it in terms of personal experience and important learning. And there's much to learn from someone who's won New York Photo Festival's, National Geographic Awards, a World Press Photo Award, and a humanitarian award by Women That Saw. And that was for a project called The Family Imprint, which is a beautiful, if not difficult to read book. But don't let that put you off. This is one of the most important photo books that I own. It really is, it truly is. The Family Imprint is the story of family, Nancy's family, looking at the experiences of two parents who were in parallel treatment for stage 4 cancer side by side. So no, not an easy subject. But the way in which this was made makes this an interview that's remained with me since the day I had the pleasure of recording with Nancy. The project, Nancy's project, looks at the simultaneity of life, the good, the bad, the important and the frivolous, even in the face of passing. It honours Nancy's parents' memory by focusing on their strength and their grace, both individually and together. And it shares the story of their final chapters, which came to a close just 364 days apart from one another. I feel blessed for many reasons in life, and meeting with Nancy has certainly been one of them, and I'd like to share that with you. Nancy, your interest in storytelling is a proper sort of one that starts from youth. You were, as you freely admit to, you were a proper storyteller as a child, weren't you?
This is the truth. I remember talking to my parents about this, and as a kid, I was very curious. I went up to strangers to ask them questions. I had no fear and no boundaries, which I now, as a storyteller professionally, I look back fondly on that because clearly it was meant to be. But I also learned that when I was a child in school, I had gained a reputation as being a bit of a tattletale. Because I loved people's stories, but I also believed deeply in justice and fairness. So if something wasn't fair or just, I would tell the teacher. Right.
But then you did study photojournalism at school, so you used that skill well. And I don't want to fast forward too much toward what we're going to talk about today, but I am interested to know a sort of plotted history of how that happened.
Yeah, sure. So I always loved photography, but I didn't actually think I could make a career out of it. And I didn't quite know who I was as a photographer. I enjoyed making pictures, taking pictures, connecting with people, using my camera. After college, I was an intern at Glamour magazine in New York City in their photo department, which was a great opportunity to learn about the business, the publication business a bit. But I also learned something even more valuable, which was that I didn't want to be in that part of the business. Right. I wanted to be the storyteller. And, I was young and naive and idealistic and had big dreams. So fast forward, I left that internship. I found an opportunity teaching photography in rural Ghana. And when I came back from that experience, I had just been so impacted and moved by the people I met and the lessons I learned, and wanted to give back to the school where I'd been teaching. And I figured, well, maybe I can do something with my photography. Yeah. So fast forward a few months, I pulled some strings, spoke to some people, and I decided to put together a really, really simple exhibition. Like, I printed the pictures myself, and I bought these like really simple matted frames, and I taped them to a wall. Yeah. This gallery allowed me to use their space in between exhibitions for 2 days, and invited everyone I knew and said, I'm looking to sell these images to raise money to build a well at the school where I was teaching. If I needed to give back in some way, even though I felt like nothing could really equate to what I feel like I gained from being there with the school. Yeah. Long story short, it took about 2 years, but I raised about $11,000.
Wow.
And we were able to build this well at the school. And over the course of this time, I realized, wow, like my photographs, I look back now and I don't think they're particularly good aesthetically, but my photographs were able to not only teach people about the access to water, clean water issue in this village, but it became a catalyst to actually bring change and create this well. Like, my photographs made a difference in the lives of these kids in this school, and how special. And I want to do it again. This is who I am, and this is what drives me. I want to do work that is meaningful and impactful.
So that was the reason. That was the reason, really, you became a photojournalist. And that you thought, well, if my pictures can make that much of a difference for me, what can I do for other people with them?
Well, and that is exactly it. That in that moment, I was like, and now I understand photojournalism in a new way.
Yeah.
And this is who I want to be and what I want to do. But I felt kind of ill-equipped. I didn't really know what I was doing. I was sort of floundering, taking jobs here and there once I got back to New York, kind of very lost. And then I ended up doing a 1-year program, the 1-year certificate program in documentary photography and photojournalism at the International Center of Photography.
And then Newsday and New York Times. I mean, these aren't bad leg ups, are they, as it goes?
Yes. So actually, I had the opportunity at the end of my program to potentially meet an editor from the New York Times. We had this big career day, and there was a line out the door waiting to meet with this editor from the New York Times. And I thought to myself, obviously, I would like to connect with them, but I don't think I'm ready. And if this is my one shot, like if I only get one shot, I need to be ready.
Yeah.
There was this editor from Newsday who didn't have a line. And I thought, okay, like let's just chat. We got to chatting. We really liked each other. She liked my work and said she would be in touch. And fast forward a few months, I started freelancing for Newsday, doing all sorts of different types of assignments, learning how to be an assignment shooter for a real publication. And that really set me up so that down the line, when the New York Times came back around, I was prepared.
So today I want to talk about The Family Imprint, a daughter story of love and loss. It's a beautiful book. Sometimes a beautiful, when we're talking about the subject of family loss, seems almost inappropriate. But I think if you could apply that word in this sense, then I think it's entirely accurate, because it's such a beautiful book.
Thank you.
Now, where does it start? I mean, We've talked about covering end-of-life stories, and for some people it's an issue that's very difficult to hear about or consume. But, as photographers, I think we're blessed with this skill. You certainly are, the empathy and the reason to photograph what we see before us. And for you, this is this incredible story of your mother and father. But how does the story start?
The story starts... Actually, it started while I was still a student at ICP. My mother had been in treatment for metastatic breast cancer for the second time. And I coincidentally needed to find a project to work on while I was a student. So I thought, well, I can photograph my mother, and that would allow me to spend more time with her. I had never done something so personal. And I felt like what I knew how to do was just be there and shoot. And she became very comfortable with me having my camera around. Fast forward 2 years, her cancer had, she was in remission, but then it came back. It's a little unclear as the in-between time, but technically it was remission. But then it came back, stage 4 everywhere. And I hadn't started photographing because I was still sort of processing what was happening when my father got his diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer.
And that was out of the blue, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. It was out of the blue. And I remember my parents called and said, hey, like, we're coming into New York City. Where do you want? Let's have dinner. And so I got us a table at my favorite restaurant. I was so excited. And we got to the dinner. And I knew something wasn't right. They were acting a little strange. And my first thought was, it must be my mother. Things must be worse than I realized. Yes. And it turned out it was my father who said, I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It's inoperable. It's pretty much a death sentence. And so in that moment, I realized, oh my God, I'm 20, I was like 27 at the time. Yeah. And here are both my parents essentially dying. Yeah. And I had to figure out a way to make sense of that because my whole reality was suddenly shattered into a million pieces.
Yeah. I mean, the incredible thing here is that you didn't, even though you've been photographing a little bit your mother, but when this happened, when this was put before you, it was actually your father, wasn't it, that said, could you make this a story? It wasn't you, it was him.
It was him, yeah. Well, I should tell you, my father was a storyteller. He was a trial lawyer, and he cared deeply for his clients and really thrived in the courtroom. He was that, if you know the movie, he was sort of the main character in My Cousin Vinny. Right. Vinny, the cousin who is this big shot, or not big shot, this lawyer from New York City, like thick Queen's accent, like over the top dramatic.
Yeah, I know it.
That was my father. And it didn't surprise me when he had asked my mother if she thought I would photograph and tell his story. And it was a no-brainer. I think I was so lost in the news that I wasn't even thinking about that. And suddenly I had a purpose. I was like, okay, yeah, of course I'll tell your story, or of course I'll be that platform for you to tell your story. And that's really what kicked off the family imprint as we know it now, which is the story of my family as my parents were in treatment for cancer side by side, and my goal, I think, was just sort of to tell our story as we were living it, the way we were living it.
Why do you think he asked you?
Frankly, I actually think there was a little bit of envy that I had spent so much time with my mother and telling her story, and he kind of wanted his moment to tell his 5 minutes of fame. Yeah, because my mother was a bit more private, and you really had to pull things out of her, whereas my father was an open book. Yeah. So, like, for example, I once sat down with a video camera because he wanted to do an interview with himself before he died. And he gave me a list of questions to ask. But as soon as I asked one question, and then he just spoke for 3 hours. Wow. He didn't even need me. He wanted to know someone was interested, I think. And I, maybe in some ways, because of what I do, kind of extending that invitation and acknowledging him and his interest and supporting him in that way. I think it was therapeutic for him to really talk about his feelings. Like, that's everyone is different. I am like my father in this way. I need to vocalize and talk about my feelings and my thoughts, everything out loud.
Did Mum then become, you say she was more private. I would assume in this side-by-side, and we'll come to this side-by-side thing in a moment, but I would imagine now that they're both going through this together. It's a shared experience, not perhaps one that they wanted to share, but it's a shared experience. Mm-hmm. Did you find that she opened up more as well? Yeah, I did. It's funny. I say she's more private, but it's also kind of in comparison to my father, who is so open. Yeah, okay. But as the weeks and months went on of them in treatment together and both living with their illnesses side by side, it was interesting to see the dynamic change, because in some ways my mother was the expert and my father was the newbie. She had cancer on and off for 18 years and he was, just diagnosed. And there were a lot of moments of humor
I don't know how to describe it. Like these moments where my father felt particularly bad for himself or was having certain pains and would make the comment to my mother that like, you don't get it. And she would laugh and be like, are you kidding me? I get it. Like I've lived it for so much longer than you. Like this isn't a competition, but like if it was, I have the experience.
One of the signature images, well, it's many signature images, but one of the images that I think is associated with this project perhaps more than any other is one of those original pictures you made. You had to go back and take it twice, I think, didn't you? Because the lens wasn't wide enough on the first occasion. but it's the one of your of mum and dad next to each other. Did you call it mirroring or?
I called it his and hers chairs. His and hers.
Yes.
His and hers.
Yes. Tell me about that picture.
So I call it that because you know how when someone gets married and they have like his and hers towels or I don't know, like I thought, you know, here they are going through this experience together and just how bizarre it was. But, you know, they had each other and this was just our reality. That photograph was one of my first, and it became sort of one of the iconic images with the project, I think, because if you have to pick one image that tells the larger story, which often as a photojournalist, you know, you try to get the whole story in one image as best as you can. That image always stood out to me because to me, it felt like it did tell the whole story. It told the story of the cancer. It told the story of the two of them in this together, supporting each other, but also dealing with their own illnesses in their own ways. My father, I think in the picture, he's kind of sort of falling asleep. And my mother is sitting there going through the bills in the mail, kind of treating her treatment and her cancer like another item on her to-do list, whereas my father was really struggling in his own way.
Yeah.
There was also this moment when I was sitting in the chemotherapy room with them when I realized that there was such interesting symmetry from my perspective. I noticed the symmetry, I noticed the light, and that's, I think, the photographer in me that you can't really turn that part off.
No.
So I had to shoot it. And suddenly when I took that picture, I wasn't thinking these are my parents sitting having chemotherapy drugs pumped through their body. I was thinking that the symmetry was interesting. You know, I don't know if that's a trick of the mind or if that's a defense mechanism, but it worked.
Well, I certainly think it's a detachment mechanism, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think without that detachment, or in the way that I often refer to it as sort of compartmentalization, I think that's what allowed me to shoot this story and to simultaneously survive and function and also advocate for them, because it gave me a little bit of a distance from the reality that was happening. And I was able to use a tool that had become second nature to me.
It was comfortable.
And very comfortable. And it was, I don't even think I realized what I was doing when I was doing it. I was just sort of going through the motions, and it was helping. You
do say that this story is also, it's not totally about disease. Sure, that's happening, and it's a conduit to the piece, I know. But you say it's a much deeper story because it's a love story. Yeah. And that's important, isn't it? It's really important. I remember once someone asked me why I didn't have as many images in the body of work where my parents were sick or in the hospital. And maybe that was a subconscious thing on my part that I wasn't including them. But to be honest, the story, cancer is what brought us to this situation. Yeah. There are diagnoses. But the story that I was telling and the story that I was documenting was the story we were living, which wasn't about cancer. It was about making the most of the time that we had left, not knowing how much. I didn't have the courage to make pictures of my mother years ago when she dealt with her end-of-life illness. And I wasn't a photographer when my father passed. But I wonder now, if having talked to photographers like yourself, I wonder now whether I'd have seen how important this could have been. Are you ever asked by people how to go about doing this? Do they say, Nancy, Tell me how to do this.
All the time. People ask me all the time. A lot of photographers have said, I couldn't have done this the way that you did. And I say, well, I couldn't have either. I didn't know what I was doing. I think that I was sort of in the right place at the right time. I had been working professionally. I was comfortable with my camera and being in uncomfortable situations. And I wasn't intentionally telling this story. I was just in it and reacting to what was happening. When people do ask, for example, a friend of a friend, I get a lot of friends of friends contacting me saying they thought this would be okay. And I welcome all contact, because I feel like once you've lived through this kind of loss, you sort of have this wealth of knowledge and experience that you can really help other people going through what they're going through. And so a friend of a friend contacted me and said, my mother is dying and I'm trying to process this. And I'm terrified and of all these things. I don't know how many days we have left, but I'm not a photographer. I'm not a writer. How do I hold on to her? And, I wasn't prepared for that, but I was just sort of speaking from the heart. And I said, one, I'm grateful that you did think about this component, like that you want to do something, because the reality is that once someone's gone, and the stories are gone and their voice is gone and all those things, as difficult as that is. So I said, you know what, my advice would be, you have your phone with you, just start recording your conversations. Right. Make notes. I hate the way that I write, so I just made bullet point notes because I wanted to remember the funny, off kilter things that happened. I wanted to remember those moments where, like talking to the nurse about, like, does my mother really, like, the funny weird jokes that happen, or the fact that I'm pretty sure my grandmother was trying to set my friends up with other people, like at my parents' shivas, like the funny, those little things. Like I was like, just record. Yeah. Don't think about it. Just record. And she was like, she felt a little awkward about it, but then she was like, you know what, I'm going to do it. And then I heard from her months later, and she said, my mom passed away, and I'm so grateful that you brought that to my attention, because I did record. And while she wasn't entirely in her right mind during that time, there were so many funny things that happened, and I get to hold on to that. I get to keep that forever. Yeah. Which is what I love about photography and really all mediums where you can capture information permanently, because, once the moment's gone, the moment's gone. I don't know. The other thing is that I'm a bit of a hoarder. I'm a collector. I desperately want to hold on to all the things I possibly can. And
do you know, I've heard photography described as many, or photographers as described as many things, but yeah, maybe we are. I've never heard it. I've thought of it that way. Maybe we are subconsciously hoarders. It's just we're hoarders of imagery.
We're hoarders of imagery, and we have a tool to do that hoarding,
and we have an excuse. Well, it's okay, I'm hoarding imagery.
And we have obsession, but that's part of who we are, and that's part of,
you're allowed it as a photographer. That sounds like the perfect excuse. So you're making this incredibly potent, very vulnerable story, and then the New York Times say they'd like to carry it. Now, you're sharing this sort of very personal family story, or you're making the personal family story for yourself initially. It's not because you're thinking, well, I'm going to make a book out of this, or I know your father was very pleased to offer up his stories, but I shouldn't think that a publication was the forefront of your mind. Did your parents mind that, or did they welcome that?
I know that they were surprised at the prospect of their very personal story becoming very public. But they said to me that if this was important to me and my career, then if this was a gift that they could give me kind of at this point, then what did they have to lose? Yeah. And look at what they had to gain. And I don't think any of us could have predicted or imagined the reaction and how much we would get back as a result of sharing our personal story. That was really overwhelming. And I'm grateful that my parents got to experience some of that kind of reader engagement before they died. Another thing that your mother and father got to experience was your marriage. I like the story of you climbing the tree to
to do some sort of marriage selfie. You had to become your own wedding photographer.
Well, when we were planning the wedding, the first thing people would ask me was, who is going to shoot your wedding? And are you going to take pictures? I think they all expected me to say, like, I've hired someone I'm not going to shoot, but they clearly, those people clearly didn't know me well enough. No, I think sometimes as photographers, we have a difficulty relinquishing control and letting go. I feel most present when I am taking pictures. So, those moments when like people are like, why don't you just put your camera down and be in the moment? I'm like, I am in the moment. This is what helps me be in the moment. Sometimes only photographers can understand and relate to that.
I do.
Yeah, thank you. So when it came to the wedding, I had been talking with the New York Times, and this seemed like a perfect sort of climax for the story, for the sake of the paper. And Jim Estrin, who is a longtime staff photographer there, and he used to run the Lens blog, and has since become a mentor of mine, was assigned actually to go to my wedding to shoot it for the paper, for the larger story. And I remember he said to me, I'm assigned to this story, but this is your story and you need to tell it. So how are you going to shoot your own wedding? I was like, okay, let's think about this. So I had the plan of wearing a camera on my shoulder while I walked down the aisle. I jokingly thought maybe I'll wear a GoPro. And the conclusion was, how about I rig a camera above the chuppah and I'll have a remote trigger in my bouquet, which
that's
foolproof, genius. It was so good.
I didn't realize that was where the trigger was.
Oh, yes. Well, no. So let me backtrack a moment. That's where the trigger was supposed to be. And just before the wedding, I decided that, you know what, I set up the shot. It's mine, my picture, my vision, but maybe for this moment, I'll relinquish the control and hand the remote off to a friend, my assistant, if you will. So I didn't have the remote in my bouquet as I had planned, but I have to tell you that, so we had two cameras, one above the tree, above the chuppah in the tree, one on the ground. Because obviously I had to get multiple angles.
Well, at one stage you're going to walk underneath the chuppah, aren't you? So you'll need that shot as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Everything was synced up. Yeah. And my friend, Jessica Earnshaw, also a photographer, was triggering the remote for me. So both cameras were firing. And even though the camera above the chuppah was firing at nothing, essentially, because we were out of view, I could hear the shutter clicking, the mirror clicking. And it brought me a certain satisfaction that I cannot explain. Like, I knew we were getting the shot.
Please tell me that you were concentrating on your vows at the same time.
I was. I'm a multitasking queen. But it just, and I don't think anyone could hear it other than me, but it was a little wedding gift. I felt like there
were some beautiful shots on that. Sadly, after the wedding, your father goes downhill reasonably quickly, and he does pass on the 40th anniversary of his mum's passing. Again, there's some humour though, isn't there? Because when you take this extraordinary picture, it's so courageous. I mean, I know he's just passed. It's a sad picture. But the story you tell of that moment is one of, there's some humour because the television's flickering on and off.
Yes, it was so insane. We were at the hospital, and the hospital room had kind of become our home at this point. Yeah. And there was a TV. We didn't really watch a ton of it, but I swear in the last hours of his life, I don't know if it's you start hyper focusing in on the little things, but the sun was setting, and that was really important to my father. He loved the sunset. He felt this unbelievable connection and passion for the sunset. It's just a thing. And the TV, the hospital TV, it was this little screen up by the ceiling, kept turning on randomly, and it was turning on to football, which was like, he loved football. He loved football so much. He was buried in his favorite football jersey. And it kind of cut the tension.
Yeah.
You know, that moment where you're like, so like, is this really happening? I can't believe this is happening. Is it happening now? And then it like cuts to a broadcast of a football game and you're like, ah! Like, but then it felt so right. We're like, is he doing this somehow? Like some magical way? I don't know. It all just felt very meant to be.
And I think with the sun streaming through the window, as you say, and the composition. I mean, can we talk about composition and light at this particular time? I think we can.
Yeah. He, like I said, my father was a storyteller. So I like to think that he had some sort of control or role. A lot of my images, I feel like, are kind of quiet. That's the other thing. There was a lot of madness in the mix, but it was the quiet moments were so visceral and so meaningful. And I guess I look back now and my photographs, I think, speak to that. And it was those little moments with the sunlight streaming in and, you know, the room was quiet. You could hear the beeps of the machines, but everything was still and beautiful. There was, even in the hospital, there's so much beauty and like honor at the end of life. And I think I never fully appreciated it until I saw it happening in front of me. But it also, my family also very much relied on humor and levity wherever we could find it in moments of deep sadness. And I think that was sort of how we were very serious for that moment, but also just, I remember fondly all the funny moments in the mix too.
And talking of quiet, the final pictures of Mum, that was a quiet moment as well. It was a beautifully composed, quiet moment. It was just, in fact, you don't see Mum's face. You see just her body. There's her hands, and her hands are being held by, I think, your brother and sister, yeah?
Yeah. You know, it was a different scene than when my father passed away. You know, he was at the hospital with lots of machines beeping and doctors and nurses coming and going. And, you know, they were strangers. And my mother didn't want that. She said, you know, when I die, I want to be at home in my bed, in my PJs, listening to James Taylor, surrounded by the people I love in the world. Yeah. And so that's what we did. And I remember in those last moments of her life, and obviously we didn't know for sure, you know, if those were her last moments, but we could tell that things were sort of shutting down. And a strange, one thing I want to note is that this was a really difficult moment, but I think I started grieving her death and my father's death long before they died. So that process of grief had already, you know, planted roots. And so in these final moments, my siblings are holding her hands, and my brother, who's also a photographer, said to me, you know, are you going to shoot this moment? And it was almost like I was so transfixed and lost in the moment that I forgot about my camera. But I'm so grateful that he did, because I got up on the bed, I took this photograph. I don't think I intentionally meant to cut off her head, but I think I'm glad that I did, because it was sort of like, it wasn't her anymore. It was this sort of, she was this being at the end of her life, and what we knew of her and loved about her had sort of already gone. At this point, it was just nature happening. And I looked down and take the picture. I put my camera down. It was pretty quiet in the room. And I remember looking over at my brother and looking at my sister, being like, you know, are you okay? It's like, how's everyone doing? And I think in that moment, she stopped breathing. And, you know, to what we were talking about earlier, I think hearing is the last thing that goes. And I think she probably felt comfort hearing us say, yeah, we're okay. Yeah. And then the moment passed. And I just remember feeling like almost frozen, like, oh my gosh, she's gone. There was something in those last couple of weeks of her life that I think, beyond photography and beyond being, you know, documenting this, I gave all of us a certain sense of purpose to care for her. And yes, maybe she couldn't walk anymore, but she could still eat. And maybe she couldn't eat anymore, but she could still laugh and listen to music. And you just start to shift.
What was the song? What was the James Taylor? You said your mum was a James Taylor fan. What was the song that was playing in the room from James Taylor that day?
It was Up on the Roof. Do you know that song?
I do.
We played it on repeat, and now, oh my gosh, I haven't thought about that song in a while, but it's kind of making me a little emotional. I feel like I was in a store and I heard it and I just started breaking down in tears because it felt like her. It felt like she was kind of talking to me and kind of winking at me. Yeah.
And my thanks to Nancy Borowick for being one of my guests on this archive of extraordinary women on this photo walk special. I'm in this wonderful woodland on week 1 of the photo walk retreat. Absolutely loving this. It's a rich tapestry of it's not lots of different trees, but it's fantastic. And the understory is rich with lichen and moss, and that's because the sun, as I've learned, that's because the light rather, reaches down and touches so much of the forest floor here. It's beautiful. It's like a sea of green, and there's so many different greens. It really is a tapestry of greens. Beautiful. Let me put my notes down and make a picture. Look at this, right ahead of me. Actually, this is perfect. So right ahead of me, there's, what's that? Is that an oak? I think it is. There's an oak that is just at the very base. It's got some beautiful sunlight just enveloping it. Look at that. Right, I've been shooting at f8, so let me go f5.6. I've been f8, f11 onwards, really, because I've been trying to get some sunbursts coming through the canopy. But 1/2/5. Oh, it's quite dark in this bit. 2000 ISO. Ooh, yeah, you're pushing it, Neil. f5.6. And there we go. Wonderful. Oh, I tell you what, Barney, don't show him the pictures from this walk. He'd be dead jealous. Why didn't you take me there? Right, this month's assignment. I've got an assignment for you. Well, I haven't got an assignment. We've got a recent guest with an assignment. Good luck with this. It's a great challenge. Send your entries in to stories@photowalk.show, stories@photowalk.show for this month's assignment.
The Photo Walk assignment.
A one-word assignment for the month of September. I'm intrigued to know what yours will be, Gary.
The word is change.
Ooh. Is that anything to do with your life? Since talking with you about how your life sort of not completely changed, but it's gone from music to photography. Is it to do with you? Is it a personal story, or?
It's because since I started becoming a professional photographer, I only have a small change in my pocket, and I used to have lots of... No, that's not the reason. The reason is...
It could be, though.
I know it is. It definitely could be. But the reason is, going back to Camden Passage, is that's something that I observed over the 4 years of doing those photographs, is how things change, you know, how people change. There are people that I photographed at the beginning of that project who are no longer with us. There are shops that have closed and new ones have come in. There's one particular fella who's actually photographed twice in that book. He's called Peter. He was in his 90s when I photographed. He's still in his 90s, but been there for many years. Since I started, he's now doesn't feel he's got the energy to have his little stall there once a week, and still goes down there with his carrier bag once a week to buy his jellied eels from the fish shop in the street. But, you know, he's getting older. Things are changing all the time. And of course, over a 4-year period, it was kind of easier to see and track that change. But I think it might be really interesting and a great challenge to try and capture change in one photograph.
Best of luck then for this month's assignment. We're already shooting through the month, metaphorically and physically with our cameras, I'm sure. So there's not too long to get those assignment pictures in. Best of luck. We'll put them on the assignments page if you send them to stories@photowalk.show, and we'll choose a winner of the brand new. It was launched this week, actually. The brand new famous, not so famous flask. It's wrapped, this one. The letters are larger. Every year we try and bring a different, every year we do bring a different flask design, and this year is no different. So the brand new, famous, not so famous, in multicolour flask is available for our winners, and we'll be choosing one from the assignment entries. Stories at photowalk.show, 2,500 pixels wide if you can, but if you can't, don't worry, I'll do the heavy lifting. Right. Our next guest in this special is Lynzy Billing, an investigative journalist and photographer. She spent years reporting from conflict zones and covering human rights issues faced by people caught in crises. Her craft has led her to some of the most dangerous parts of the world. My second guest this week is Lynzy Billing.
Lynzy, as I talk to you, you're actually in the UK. I find it very difficult to keep in touch with where you will be at any one given moment. It seems you are a journalist and photographer, very comfortable with life out of a suitcase.
I am constantly unpacking and repacking suitcases. That's true.
Were you driven by any one particular photojournalist or journalist in this adventure?
Oh, that's such a hard question. You know what? I think that growing up, there was always photographers that there was photographers that I had more of an interest in, and they did tend to be photojournalists and working in conflict zones. And now, I mean, every few weeks, I'm finding new photographers on Instagram, and I have more of an interest in them, and they have different styles. So it's like an ever-changing little book of my favorite photographers, you know?
And how did you actually start in this book? Because you're an investigative journalist first. The photography part of it is, it's part of the important package now, because I think, and it's something I've talked about so much with photojournalists, that now they find themselves really being the storytellers, the written storytellers and the photographic storytellers. And that's, of course, very true with yourself, isn't it? Although you've come at it from the other way round. It was the writing first, photography second.
It was, it was the I never studied journalism, actually. I studied photography at university. And I went on and I joined the news desk as a photo editor, and I was working for some newsrooms in London. And so I always had an interest in photography. I studied it, but I always wanted to be a writer, and I didn't have the training. I never studied it. So while I was on the news desk at BuzzFeed first, I spent a lot of time trying to convince the editors to let me write stories, as well as I was going out on jobs for them, photographing and doing assignments. And I always wanted to write as well. And then I remember the first story the editor at BuzzFeed let me write, and there was this wave of Syrians who had arrived in the UK, and I went up to Manchester to meet them and photograph them, but also interview them. And that was my first written piece. And then I joined Metro newspaper, and I was always trying to write with them as well. And the head of news was very adamant that my job was not writing, that it was being a photo editor. But I still managed to write with them. And then I went freelance and I started writing more that way. So I've totally come at it from a really kind of strange place in a way. So that's, I think, why now I toggle both. When I do a story, when I'm always... I don't do commissions. I only pitch editors. And when I pitch a story, I always pitch a written piece with photographs and sometimes video as well.
I mean, you come at it from having to pitch your work all the time. And I'm finding, again, referencing back to something I said a moment ago, more and more photographers are finding themselves from a commercial stance having to pitch their ideas and taking extraordinary, not just life risks, and we'll come to that in a moment, but financial risks in having to, well, you've got this self-belief on what you're pitching. And many of your stories are the stories that others don't attempt to do, aren't they?
Well, that's very kind. I think I do pitch stories that I feel like I haven't seen. If there's a subject or something that I think is important to say, a lot of times that's with features. Mostly I'm focused on features and investigations. I don't do breaking news. So if there's a story that I feel like is important and I haven't seen it anywhere, then that's the one I want to do. If I've seen the subject covered at all, then I don't want to do it.
And are these stories that you see as perhaps long tail projects that you will go and photograph and write about them, but it's very likely that you're going to take those stories further and much further? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, I do a lot of the features I do will, I'll spend a year on them, but I'm doing multiple at once. Like right now I'm working on 15 stories at once. One of them I've been on for 3.5 years.
Oh my word.
Another one I've been on for 2 years. So they're all like going on at the same time, but I always do stories that take a long time and I have to revisit people for interviews. I'll never interview someone once. I'll go back and meet them multiple times over the course of years.
And what is the pitching process? How do you take a story that you're fascinated in from an investigative point of view and encourage and enthuse somebody else to have to put their pen on a checkbook for you? It's brutal.
Yeah. It's tough. I remember when I was on the newsroom, when I first joined BuzzFeed, I said to them, we need to be doing a lot of world photo features. And they told me no one cares about these kind of photo features from different parts of the world. And I said, people really do. And so I built that up with them then. And that's kind of how it is in freelance now. Like you say, I have to convince an editor that their readership is really going to care and also just engage with the story. Like it's difficult with Afghanistan because it's a country that has been so heavily covered, for the last 20 years. But the interest has, waxed and waned, right? And right now we're seeing this huge drop off when I pitch editors and I say there's a story from Afghanistan. And I already know that they're kind of like, well, we don't have a huge interest in that right now because there's not been some big event in the news. America's left, coalition forces have left. So it is really hard to convince them. But I do think that at the end of the day, if the story has some kind of human connection in it, then people will relate to it, whether it's family, something to do with mental health or some kind of emotional connection. It doesn't matter where it is in the world. That's a story that someone's going to read and in some way, I hope, relate to it.
Well, I'm glad you said human connection because that does lead me to a question about a very recent piece that you wrote. I think it's very easy to slip into a somewhat, and you've alluded to this really, westernized approach to imagining the life of a journalist in Afghanistan, a life in Afghanistan, and imagine that you must forever be in some kind of, well, if not danger, heightened sense of alert. When your work is equally about life, it's about the day-to-day, it's about human connections. For example, on the Al Jazeera website, one of your leading stories is about the teeth makers of Kandahar. Tell me about that story and Sultan and how you managed to enthuse editors to follow that story, because it is a really interesting, some might say simple story of life, but it's a very important story to tell the world that there's so much more to Afghanistan than what we see on the lead stories when the troops and the coalition were in there. Yeah, no, absolutely. There's so many amazing people and stories and in Afghanistan that never get touched, have yet to be discovered, or not discovered, I should say, told. But the teeth maker story was, I remember the photograph by Steve McCurry that he took in 1998 of this teeth maker in Kandahar, and I always thought, it was just one of these great photos in his collection. I really liked it. But then recently when I was back in Kandahar earlier this year, I was thinking, what happened to this man? It would be really interesting to see if he's
still around, still making these dentures out of his little shop. So I started going around the city center and asking people if they knew who this man was, and showing them the photograph by Steve McCurry. They were like, everyone knew him, and they directed me to the shop, and that's how I found the family. And the man in the photograph has passed away now, but then I met all the, his sons and their sons, and the family continuing it now. And I just think it's a really nice, there's something in Afghanistan where it feels like time stands still. And I feel like the Teeth Maker story is one of these examples. You had this American photographer go in years ago, and the shop looks exactly the same as how he witnessed it.
And something piqued my interest as well, the bicycle in the story.
Yeah.
Let me read from the article, your words. Suspended from the ceiling at the back of the shop is the bicycle that appears in McCurry's photograph of Sultan's father. People have tried to buy that bike ever since, haven't they, I think?
Yeah, it's brilliant. I love those little things that you can, and they peeled back the new IEA flag to show the old shop front as well, which is just shows the kind of strange transitions going on right now as well. But yeah,
it's all a question of balance, and I imagine it must be a balancing act in terms of the stories you tell. The headline, "A Letter to the Taliban Men Who Drove Me From My Home," would meet perhaps a raised eyebrow by authorities who might not want you might not appreciate that kind of intro and retrospection to be printed, photographed and recorded by you. Do you find permissions difficult?
Oh, it's been an interesting year in terms of permissions. I went back when I say went back, I mean after the change of government last August, I went back in January, and I've spent most of this year back in Afghanistan. And the first thing I did when I got back was I got the new work permit, the new IEA work permit. I got my letters of permission to report anywhere in the country. I did all this kind of bureaucratic paperwork, and it was going okay. And then, as time went on, as the months went on, as I think most journalists felt, it was going to become more restrictive on what we could do. It became really difficult. They then asked journalists to visit provincial local offices and tell them what stories they were doing. Some journalists would go out, with a kind of Taliban bodyguard. I would never do that. It did become really difficult. I ran into some issues with them in Kandahar as well that wasn't very pleasant. I had issues where it got to the point where I'd have to go to government offices and they would tell me that women can't come into government offices. But that was because they weren't treating me as a foreign journalist. They were, I presume, or I feel they didn't quite understand where I was from. And they were treating me a bit differently to how they were rolling out the carpet for a foreign journalist. And as we know, Afghan journalists have just been completely cuffed at every turn in terms of reporting on their own country. So it's been super difficult, and it gets more and more difficult. And I never know if I'm going to get told I can't continue my work anymore. But I try.
But beyond that nationality, this is where, because there's a slight hint of the American lilt in your voice here and there from the East Coast, I think. And there's the English background. You're visiting relatives at the moment as we speak in, I think, Plymouth, wasn't it, in the southwest? But your nationality is also. Were you born in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I'm half Afghan and I'm half Pakistani.
Right.
But I'm adopted by a British family, so I have British citizenship, and I hope to. I'm surprised you think I have an American accent, but I think that's probably from international schools growing up, because I grew up. A lot of my life was in Jerusalem, in Israel.
I mean, the reason I say that is there's certain words here and there. But then, having said that, then you said the last sentence, and I thought, it could be East End of London in places. But I'm wondering if you use that Britishness that you can call upon to, and you may have answered this question already, really, to use that to be able to go forth and tell stories more easily in the country. Or does it just not, am I being naive and it just doesn't work that way because you have your Afghan papers too?
I try very hard. I do. I'm not going to lie. I do try to use the British card. It's really differs from person to person. It could be very different with a Taliban official in the city versus, or in Kabul in the capital versus one in the provinces. It really depends. So how they take me. Some of them are really not buying the British card. A lot of them have asked me where I got my fake passport from.
Oh, really?
So,
okay.
yeah. But yeah, it's going to be, I think, increasingly difficult to do the reporting I want to do, and I'm already feeling that. I've had a lot of difficulty over the last few months, a lot of run-ins, a lot of no's. But I don't know the best approach because it's changing so fast, except for just to keep going and keep trying with it.
The country's in this grip of spiraling humanitarian, social and economic crises, as I've read through your writings. The children that you photograph, though, Lynzy, have a resilience like I certainly can't imagine. And they must be some of the harder stories to tell. How do you go about those stories?
It is super tough. I think maybe a lot of journalists would say this, but I do, when I'm reporting or when I'm photographing particularly difficult situations that people are in, there is this kind of thing where you get on and you do the job without sounding kind of harsh about it, but I speak to, that's my favorite part of my job, is speaking to people. I speak to people all day, and you speak with people and you photograph people, but it's when you get home that you think about it. It can be very frustrating as a foreign journalist with what you can do to help and what is out of your hands. It can feel quite helpless at times, because in the end of the day, I do also think, we do this reporting from the ground, and it gets sent into a very heavily polarized world of, editors across the world who, for them, Afghanistan feels really far away. And you do think, what impact does this reporting have when it just kind of gets sent off into, and someone's reading it from the other side of the world? Do they really feel how difficult it is for this family that I'm sat in front of? It's such a hard thing to do, and I think that's essentially what you want to do when you tell a story. There's a feeling or there's something to say, and you want that to really come across as it is to someone else, so they learn and they engage with it, and hopefully they feel like, well, is there something I can do?
And my thanks to Lynzy Billing. I tell you what, this moss, I won't do it because I'm acutely aware it's not the right thing to do, but I can lay myself down in that moss over there. That looks every way as every bit as good as a nice soft bed. Nature's soft bed, the understory. My thanks then, yes, to Lynzy Billing. Next up on this special is Susan Goldberg, a prominent American journalist and editor known for her leadership in the media industry. Susan made history as the first female editor-in-chief of National Geographic, a position she held from 2014 to 2021. An interesting point is made by Susan during our conversation about the day we no longer need to say somebody is the first female editor-in-chief, or dare I say, president. No, it will simply be known as the norm. That was the point that Susan Goldberg makes within this discussion we're about to have. She'll do it so much better than me, of course. So my next guest on this special is Susan Goldberg.
An 8-week internship at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer is where this incredible time as a journalist began. But I've read that you credit your early career success, Susan, to that time there as well. And I think we all have fondness, don't we, for the first newsroom we stepped into, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. And, I look back at that internship sort of as the start of everything good that's ever really happened to me started there at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer.
Well, what did you learn particularly, do you think?
I think I learned that I wanted to, be a journalist more than anything. I had been a journalist in college, but just that 8 weeks, and I covered everything from plane crashes to a square dance festival. I just was so excited by getting up every day, by being around the newspaper, by being around those kind of people people by that jolt of energy every day, by the adrenaline rush of it all, by having a deadline on getting up and doing it all over again the next day. I just absolutely loved it. And to me, it was addicting, and it's been addicting for 42 years.
Do you know, I'm not sure if this is an unfair question, really, Susan, but I remember my first sub-editor, who was a chap that worked on Fleet Street, named Ron, who was a proper grumpy man, and introduced me to the newsroom really at the sharp end of making tea for him for at least 2 weeks of that, I think. Do you have a character that you think, again, we'll use that word fondly of during those formative weeks there?
Oh, well, there were so many, but I also remember the editor well. His name was Jim Rennie, and he was a Canadian guy, quite emotional, I would say, kind of a little over the top, sometimes yelled, sometimes was, super friendly, laughed loudly. I was terrified of him, completely terrified of him. So I remember at the end of the 8-week internship, he came up to me and he kind of growled all the time. He said, "So kid, do you want to stay?" It's like, yeah, I want to stay. And that's how I got my first job. I actually wasn't quite done with college. I still had 12 credits to go. So I had to call up my dad, who was a college professor. And I say, "Pop, I am dropping out of college and I'm going to stay here at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and I'm going to be a reporter full time." And there's this long pause on the phone. My dad is back in Michigan. Silence, silence, silence. And then my dad says the most unexpected thing he had ever said to me, which was, "Good for you, Susan. We're very proud of you."
Wow.
And I don't know where he found that within himself, because I thought he was going to have a different response completely. And that's really where I feel like my career began. And I always do tell people, though, I did finally finish college, but it took like 8 years. But it was that moment where, my dad's not just begrudging approval, but his endorsement of my choice, it gave me so much confidence to go forward.
Being a female journalist in a newsroom, and you said 42 years ago, times, and I know this from talking to photojournalists and journalists, incredible trailblazing women of the newsroom around the world, that they said times were very different then.
Times were very different then, although frankly, times have not changed as much as, as I wish that they would have. I think young female journalists, young journalists generally, and people of color in our profession continue to face a lot of barriers and a lot of obstacles, and women in particular face a fair degree of harassment. I think we think about it in different ways than we used to, thank goodness, right? Because it never would have occurred to me really to complain or to, I just sort of kept doing what I was doing. But I should have complained a bunch of times, right? I should have complained when I was a young journalist covering the state capitol in Lansing, Michigan, and I walked into the press room of UPI, United Press International, a former news service, and there up on the wall were all these Playboy centerfolds tacked up on the wall. I mean, like, really? This is a professional newsroom located inside the capital of the state of Michigan, and I actually just was sort of sighed, rolled my eyes, and went about my business. But it was that kind of stuff that we almost became inured to, and we shouldn't have, right? We should have gone, get that down, that's inappropriate. And now I'm really glad, women would say that. And anybody should say that. Frankly, men should say that too. But then we didn't say that.
Well, we don't sadly have time to plot and chart your entire career. And I sense we could be here for a good couple of hours if we did. But I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued by how you became editor, then editor-in-chief at National Geographic magazine. And in a career of firsts, it is worth pointing out that you are the first woman to become editor in its, I did the maths, 133-year history.
Right. So I've been editor for 8 years. So I guess you could say it only took them 126 years to find a woman for the job.
I knew you were going to do that. And I was thinking, I'm sure my maths hasn't done its job properly.
Well, look, the fact is I'm 62 years old. So my career has developed on this seam of societal change. So I've been honored and had the opportunity to be, the first woman this and the first woman that a whole bunch of different times. I was the first female editor of the San Jose Mercury News and the first female editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the first woman to run Bloomberg's Washington bureau. And then eventually I became the first female editor-in-chief of National Geographic. But I must tell you that we're going to be living in a better place when there are fewer female firsts, right? When just having a woman in charge is the normal course of doing business, whether you're talking about journalism or banking or law or politics or whatever it is. But I think it is largely because of the age that I am and the opportunities that I therefore was able to have.
Does the responsibility weigh particularly heavy, knowing how respected the magazine is and the fact that for many it's the trusted source and conduit to their knowledge about the world, isn't it?
Well, I certainly think, particularly in the early days when people did not travel as much, right? As you point out, the magazine starts in 1888 and it, comes up during period of colonialism. America, certainly in the early part of the 20th century, people did not get out the way they do now. And so I do think we provided a first view of the world to many people beyond their own communities, and for some people, perhaps even beyond their own neighborhood. Yeah. And there's a huge responsibility in that. And the responsibility is to get the story right in words and in pictures, and to make sure our journalism is authentic. And that is something that, we work on and struggle with continually. And I think the burden now is sharper than ever, right? We know that just parachuting people into exotic locales is not the way to go about it. We really need to find people who are familiar with the places where we're telling those stories from, both in words and in pictures. And there's only one good thing I'll tell you about COVID, and that is that it really forced us to crank up something we were already doing, which is making sure that we've got journalists in places that all over the world. So we're not just flying people in there. When we want to tell a story out of South Africa, let's use a South African photographer. We don't do that every single time, but we're doing that more and more and more.
We talk, as you would imagine, on a photography podcast about citizen photojournalism, getting a photograph that otherwise may not be captured. And that's possible thanks to 15 billion mobile devices out there at the latest 2021 estimated figures. How has that affected what you see, Susan, and take on in one of the world's most famous outlets for quality journalism and pictures?
Well, it's interesting. The advent of cell phone cameras and everybody having a camera with them 24/7. Initially, I thought, this is going to not be great because everybody's posting their pictures on Instagram, which is true. But the fact is most people can't take pictures worth a darn, right? And I count myself among them. I am not a professional photographer by any stretch. And so it does make me appreciate the craft and the skill and the bravery and the patience and all of the things that go into being a great photographer. And our photographers, use their phones to take pictures too. The cameras are quite good, and it does allow them, particularly in crowded places, in scenes, in protests or something, to kind of fade into the woodwork. They look just like everybody else with a phone, right? They don't have these giant lenses hanging off their necks. And so it does allow them to kind of fade into the woodwork and get those authentic images. But I really do think the more images there are in the world, the more great photography stands out as exceptional. And I think it explains why we're the largest brand on Instagram. There is no brand larger than National Geographic on Instagram.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to mention that a bit, because Instagram has this kind of love-hate relationship with photography and photographers, despite it being a platform that they grace. I was going to ask what your opinion of the platform is. Obviously, it's important, but do you have a personal stance on it as well?
Well, look, I think it has been an incredibly important commercial platform for National Geographic. We've got about 190 million followers across our various Instagram accounts. I think our main account has around 175 or 100 80 million followers. It is an important way for people to see our work, to get them into National Geographic. Of course, some people will just scroll through and look at the pictures and read the captions, but other people will start to get really interested. They'll swipe up into the stories. They'll want to engage with us across more and more platforms beyond Instagram. So Instagram sort of just becomes their way into a larger National Geographic world, and I think it's a very important commercial proposition for us.
The book itself involved you spending, I don't know, Susan, how many hours, weeks, months finding definitive images. How did you even start?
Well, you know, it's really hard, and it's something we do every day, right? With what images are going to be on Instagram, images are going to be on nationalgeographic.com or in our monthly magazine or in our great books. So we are used to really making a lot of hard choices when it comes to images. We've got about 2 million images coming into the National Geographic archives every single year. So to do a book about the 21 years of the 21st century means you've got about, 42 million images that you're looking at. And I cannot tell you I looked at every one of them. But I think what we were looking for were, of course, images that tell the story, that make people stop, that make them look more deeply at what was going on, whether it's something they were familiar with, like the images, for instance, around 9/11. We have several photographs of that, or something that happened that they had no idea was going on, or shows them some aspect of nature or how the planet is changing because of climate change that they did not know, and draws them into what is our shared story of the 21st century.
The major events, of which there are many already, included the pivotal 9/11, that central event from which many others formed. How did you even start to decide how that could be represented from all those images that you have as a larger body and collection?
You know, one of the images that we included in there of 9/11, it doesn't show the towers at all. It's a picture by Lynn Johnson, who is one of our most wonderful longtime contributors. And it's a picture of 3 first responders. And for anybody who is old enough to remember 9/11, you can just look at these 3 people and they're all looking up. And you see kind of this dust in the air and the expression on their face and the shock and the horror of it. And you know exactly what day it is, even though you don't see the towers. All you see is these 3 people looking up. And you know exactly where you are and what has just happened for anybody old enough to have been there. And I think in some ways, too, this book is not just a great journey through time for those of us who have lived it, but it's a great history for younger people who haven't lived it.
I suppose really emotionally it must have affected you putting this together. There are some harrowing pictures in there.
Well, there are harrowing pictures, but there are happy pictures. There's inspirational pictures. But hopefully, more than anything, I think they're pictures that make you think, right? Yeah. Make you stop and make you think.
Is it fair to ask what are the biggest moments for you that you knew you had to feature? 9/11 would clearly be one of those.
We've got a number of pictures in here around the racial reckoning in the United States in 2020 and beyond. So I think some of those were incredibly important. We have a picture of an incredible scientific breakthrough that I think is one of the most astounding pictures in the book. It's of a face transplant.
Yes,
so this is right. This is also taken by Lynn Johnson, who spent 30 hours inside the operating room at the Cleveland Clinic, and she captures the moment when the face is taken. It is already off of the donor, a young woman who died tragically of an opioid overdose, and this face has been put on a tray, and it is on its way to be put on and become the new face of a young woman named Katie Stubblefield, who needed that face transplant to live. And so the face is midway through its journey, and it's literally on a tray. It's kind of shocking, but it's also beautiful. It's on a tray, and you see these doctors clustered around it, and one of them is even taking a picture of the face, and they're looking at it in almost a reverent way. And I think this is one of the most astonishing pictures. And it is a picture of a medical breakthrough, but it is also a picture that tells you about a young woman's determination to have a second chance at life. And I just love this picture.
It was an incredible picture. And I mean, as you say, double taking on that one, I had to look at it. I thought, is this real? it's a very different picture to interpret, isn't it?
Well, I think a lot of people were struck by the picture. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in photography. And so I just think it's one of those, like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? And I want to know more pictures. Another picture in a very different way that I think also strikes that bell is the picture that we have that was on our cover in January 2017 of a young transgender girl. This is a 9-year-old transgender girl named Avery Jackson. And photographer Robin Hammond went around the world and he took pictures of 9-year-old kids, and he did it for our issue that we did on gender. So we went all over the world and we said to these 9-year-olds, what's it like to be a boy in your society? What's it like to be a girl? What would it be like if you were someone of the other gender? And somewhere in the process of doing this, we realized that actually we needed to talk to transgender people as well. And that is how we met Avery Jackson in Kansas City, Missouri, who looked straight into the camera, looked right at Robin, and said the most incredible thing. She said, the best thing about being a girl is now I don't have to pretend to be a boy. I mean, out of the mouths of babes, right? Yeah. These 9-year-olds are incredibly intelligent and articulate. And we put her on the cover of National Geographic, and it was an arresting photo that got a lot of attention.
Well, this is probably a good time to ask you, what makes a potent front cover? What do you look for?
Well, of course, our covers aren't always photos either, right? Sometimes we do use a fair amount of illustration as well. Yeah. But what we want is a picture that just tells a big story and that can get somebody's attention. Yeah. I do think the whole idea, though, of the cover is changing. I mean, the cover used to be very important for newsstand sales, but the newsstand has become a very squishy thing, right? COVID has kind of speeded up a trend that we were already seeing, all of us in print media. Newsstand is not as a big a part of our bottom line as it used to be. It can even, frankly, be hard to find a newsstand in which to buy a magazine. Either way, what we really want is a picture that just makes somebody go, I want to know more.
And humor, of course, plays a part. One of the pictures we're able to show on the show page is the polar bear just nudging in to the photographer's lodge. I'm not sure I think I'd have been closing the window a little bit faster and perhaps not thinking about making a frame at that moment.
Well, Paul Nicklin is a very experienced Arctic photographer, right? And this very self-same polar bear had already eaten his hat. Yeah. He ate the seat of his snowmobile. And Paul goes into the cabin and opens that window. And there is this polar bear just coming back for more. This is a picture with both beautiful lighting and beautiful framing, but it is, as you say, one of those pictures that just makes you stop and say, oh boy, what's happening here? What is going on?
Well, the first thing I thought, Susan, was close the window. What's the feedback been like so far?
Oh, tremendous. Yeah. I mean, look, if you go back to where this century began, it really started with Y2K, right? I remember being at the newsroom of the San Jose Mercury News for Y2K, and we were all working way late because we thought everything was going to stop, right? We thought all the computers were going to crash. It was going to be a big disaster. And of course, absolutely nothing happened. And so this is a book of our lives that begin really right after that moment and right up to the present. And I think so many people can just relate to it.
Photographically, does anything still surprise you?
Oh, I get surprised every single day. That's one of the great things about being the editor of National Geographic is getting to look at the work and tons of the work, all of the work of these amazing photographers that we are so privileged to work with around the world, and all different kinds of pictures. And suddenly you find yourself interested in subjects that you never thought you'd be in. I mean, I am not a scientist. I've never been a science writer, but some of our science-y photographers get me really interested in learning more about these topics.
Do you miss being out there telling the stories?
Occasionally I do. But I think there's so much gratification of working with our great writers and our great photographers and with the editors to tell the stories. And it is so wonderful being a journalist at this point in the 21st century because we have so many ways to tell stories, right? So many platforms that allow us to reach a larger and more diverse audience than we ever could just in print. And I think that's a real privilege of being a journalist right now.
And my thanks to Susan Goldberg for our conversation a few years ago. And now Susan is most certainly one of my proudest interviews, I think, within the archive that we have on the Photo Walk. It sounds very hollow, the ground here. Oh, maybe not that bit. Just now it was. I could end up stamping through this forest. I'll have people looking at me thinking, what is he doing? No, as I was coming down here, it was, there we go. Oh, I don't know. I shouldn't have started that, should I? It's the Photo Walk of a Friday. I'm on retreat this week, for 2 weeks actually. I'm in Scotland with guests attending the Photo Walk, the Scottish Photowalk Retreat 2024. There will be a special edition where you'll hear what we got up to from some of our special guests who took some workshops. There's some poetry. There's our creative writing workshop with the author Merrin Glover. I can't wait to bring you that episode. I'm in the first week and we're having such a fantastic time, and we have a second week to come. So there'll be a Scottish Photowalk Retreat show coming up. It's all specials in September. Every week's a special, Neil. Oh, it feels like it, doesn't it? I'd like to finish with a guest from the archive who is not an international photojournalist or an editor-in-chief. I hope you've enjoyed this week, our dip back into the archive of some very, very special guests. And Nicky Heppenstall is one of those. I'd like you to meet somebody who I feel very proud to say is a member of our Extra Mile community. Nicky Heppenstall of Remember My Baby. It's a UK-based charity, RMB, and it offers remembrance photography services to parents experiencing the loss of their baby before, during, or shortly after birth, providing them with cherished memories during a deeply difficult time. I know today there's been much talk about, with my guests, it's part of the circle of life of passing. But I think the work that RMB does and the work that we can all do as photographers, I think it can be very special. It can be very special. It's a unique gift that photographers have. It is. We're creative. We think creatively. But above that, I think I speak for myself perhaps, and what I hope is my imprint on the world. I think what we can have is a tremendous amount of empathy, and I think that empathy can shine forth through the photographs that we make and the people that we meet and make those photographs for. And the reason why Nicky is in this particular special edition is because she is an extraordinary woman. And this particular organisation is really an extraordinary organisation. What they do is selfless, and they work with some of the bravest and most vulnerable people, and they do it with a real dignity. And that's why, really, I'm very pleased to bring you as a final guest today, Nicky Heppenstall.
Nicky, I want to get a fix on your own photography first, your background, from where you've come with a camera.
Yeah, I was always a keen photographer. I think I get it from my dad. He was a keen amateur photographer, had a darkroom when I was at home. So from the age of 5 or 6, I remember the darkroom smells, and he used black and white film and processed all his own pictures, which was great. So I think it's in the family. Relatives of his in the Liverpool area actually ran a chain of photographic shops.
Right.
So I've always been keen on taking pictures. And then when I actually lost my second child, I had a stillborn daughter. I had a film camera at the time. That was 20 years ago. That was a bit of a shock, unexpected, which it mostly is.
Yeah.
And I did take some photographs of her, but I'm amazed they're actually sharp, given the situation we were in. They're not ideal. But that had a huge impact on me on many levels, obviously. But specifically for the photography, I came across a charity sometime later run from the United States, which offered remembrance photography to people in my situation. Yeah. So I looked into that and I thought, right, I have to do this. I have to do this so that other people can have images. By this time I was digital. So I upped my game. I got some training. I upgraded my kit, software, etc. So I actually became a professional photographer specifically so that I could volunteer for that charity.
And what was the timescale at this point?
So that was about 9 years post-loss, I think. Fast forward to 2014, and some like-minded individuals, other photographers, passionate about this particular type of photography, we launched Remember My Baby in the UK. The UK really needed a dedicated charity for this.
So you had been photographing babies in that time, had you?
Only a few.
Right.
It was quite hard to promote the American charity in the UK, it didn't really. We weren't going very far. We didn't meet many families. So once we'd launched Remember My Baby, we went from strength to strength, really. And we're in our 7th year. We'll turn 7 next month. We've met over 4,500 families.
I know, it's incredible.
And we've delivered over 152,000 images free of charge, which is it's just amazing. It fills me with a sort of humble kind of pride. It's a bit odd. You know, for me to be part of an organisation that can facilitate the quality images that we're able to deliver free of charge when these are the only photographs families are going to get. Because there's no first steps and first day at school, etc. No. You know, all of that is lost. All of that potential for taking photographs is lost. And it's kind of the silver lining in my stillbirth cloud. I wouldn't be doing this if I hadn't lost my daughter. I don't have great images. They're not ones I really want to share. But the images I see coming across my monitor from our volunteers are, honestly, sometimes they take my breath away.
But to quote, actually, our goal is to offer a service of baby remembrance photography to parents suffering the loss of their baby in every hospital and birth centre across the UK. So perhaps we should be very clear on what the service is. How do you help parents? What exactly is the service that you offer? How does it work?
There's 2 things that we offer. The core service is remembrance photography. So we have a network of volunteer photographers across the UK, most of whom are professional. Some are highly skilled non-professionals, or they've retired or whatever, or it's a second career for them, or whatever. Hospitals get in touch with us to let us know that a family are in need, and our volunteers will go into the hospitals around their work and family lives to provide high-quality portraits. Black and white images, usually baby with family, mum and dad, sometimes siblings, sometimes extended family. These are provided 4 to 6 weeks later on a USB with our logo on, with a handwritten note from the photographer on a postcard that we make free of charge. So these are permanent, tangible memento reminder of a situation where they came away from hospital with empty arms. And sometimes you can feel like did I dream that? You know, did I really have that baby? It's a bit like, well, for me, it was a bit like having an out-of-body experience, really. It was a bit like I was expecting for someone else. You know, my baby died at birth. And for me to be able to be part of an organisation that captures these images for families in this situation is just incredible. The other service that we do is editing. Photo retouching. I was
about to mention the editing, because that's a very important part of it. Because I understand, actually, that a lot of volunteers who think, what a fantastic idea, I would love to be a part of this, but don't feel ready to photograph, can actually still offer a lot of value to the charity, can't they?
Yeah, totally. A lot of volunteer photographers, or a lot of photographers that we ask if they'd like to get involved, are like, "Oh, I'm not sure I could do it. I'm too emotional. I don't think I could hold it together." Yeah. And we say, "Well, how about editing?" And you are seeing some images that could be upsetting or distressing, because not all babies are in excellent condition. We do see blemishes and skin tears and bruising and such like. So that can be a bit harrowing. That can be a bit challenging, but you're not in the room with the family. So it's a huge ask to say to a person, please go to this hospital and meet this family who've just lost their baby. Walk into that room with that fresh, raw grief.
Yes.
However, for us to be out of our comfort zone for half an hour or an hour, depending how long we're there, we're providing images that bring an enormous amount of comfort to that family for years, because we can go back to our normal lives, but this family have to live with that grief. But editing images for photographers who can't manage the editing, either because they're booked back to back with weddings, etc., or perhaps the editing is a bit too distressing for them. If it wasn't such a smooth session, it does vary the emotion in the room.
Yeah.
Or if it's technically challenging, such as tube removal, where we meet a baby in a neonatal unit, for example, they may have tubes and sticking plasters and such over their face. For a few images from that session, if the parents would like, then the editing team will remove the tubes and medical paraphernalia.
Yeah.
So the editing is just as important. And in fact, through lockdown, when we suspended our service last year for several months, the editing team continued to edit throughout. And where we were contacted, we said to hospitals, if staff or if the families have taken images themselves, either on a camera or a ward camera or their phones, we can edit.
Yeah.
So the editing team did a lot of editing through the suspension of our service.
Nicky, I don't want to pry, but I am going to ask, if this service had been available to you when you lost your second child, is it something you would have wanted yourself?
Absolutely. I can't imagine not having my images. I just can't imagine that.
Yeah.
I don't have my baby. I don't have the memories that I could have captured, that I have captured with my other children. I don't look at them very often, but when I do, I can remember the midwife being so kind, who took footprints and handprints and a lock of hair. And I actually took a video camera in and I filmed that over her shoulder.
Wow.
And I remember smiling to myself, because back then, this was 20 years ago, so back then it was a black ink pad, just like you'd use in an office.
Yeah.
Now they have special wipes and special paper, so they apply the wipe to the baby's hands and feet, carefully apply the baby's hands and feet one at a time to the paper, and then whatever that is in the wipes develops on that special paper. So now the baby's hands and feet are clean. They look clean. But my baby's hands and feet were covered in black ink at the time. But I remember smiling behind the video camera when the midwife was taking those hand and footprints and that lock of hair. And that's a warm memory for me. That's a positive memory for me.
Although this isn't about funerals today, I did want to mention one that I photographed for a boy called Felix, who passed away but days old. Something that had happened a few times before to his parents. But they didn't want Felix to go out of the world unremembered, essentially. They felt the funeral service, hard that it was a way of saying you lived. It might not have been for long, but you did, and we want to celebrate that. And I remember talking to people and friends and relatives who Nicky, frankly, they didn't get it. They practically turned their noses up in disbelief, from a practical stance, if you will. But getting your message out must meet that response from some people.
Oh, yes. We do have some people who are stunned or mildly surprised. And best case scenario for us is that they think, wow, actually, that's a really good idea.
Yeah.
Because it is. It is an incredible idea. Some families don't participate for religious reasons. Some photographers wouldn't apply to us for religious reasons, and we totally respect that completely. But for these days, childbirth is all about informed choice. And we are so determined that parents facing the loss of their baby shouldn't have it any different. No. Informed choice. We feel strongly they need to be informed of this service and have the choice of taking it up. We've got 300 photographers on the list. Not all are active. Some hospitals don't call, which is like, well, why? But we want this to be a choice for parents, because we absolutely know from feedback from the parents that we've heard from, that this is really hugely helpful in their grieving process.
Well, you mentioned something very important there, the hospitals calling, because I wanted to try and understand the process by which this happens. At some stage, a phone call has to be made. Somebody needs to, in the hospital in the first place, and maybe this is the reason why some don't call, have to have belief in it and understand it. And how does that process happen then? What puts everything into action so that a photographer turns up and does what they need to do?
We have links established now with over 100 hospitals. 7 years into this, we've got quite a lot of hospitals on board, but there's plenty to go at yet. There's best part of 300 odd around the country. So when the family is faced with this situation in their hospital, usually a midwife or a neonatal nurse will call our free phone number. That's answered 24/7 by a human being.
Right.
No voicemail. Since we've made that change to our service, every single call is answered, which is vital because this is a time-sensitive situation. So the details are taken down and forwarded to our team of volunteers. We have a team of session coordinators. So they will look at the details and post out an alert to the photographers in that area, the local team. The photographers need to then let us know, are they available? We do follow up with text. We use Facebook quite a lot, but in text and occasionally WhatsApp for trying to get in touch with them.
Yeah.
When the photographers get in touch to say, sorry, no can do, I'm at a wedding, or no can do, I'm out of area, whatever reason, the others hopefully will say, well, I can, but I can't get there till 6. Well, I can, but I can't get there till other half's home to look after the children. Well, I can, but I need someone to cover my school run. Give me 5 to see if I can get a friend or neighbour to cover my school run. So we try and attend the hospital same day or next day. So the photographer will go to the hospital, meet the family. There's a consent form to fill in, a bit of paperwork. They'll explain briefly about what's going to happen. And basically, we then will capture photographs of baby, usually in the Moses basket or being held or both, depending. There's a flow to the session when you get there. If baby's in the Moses basket when I arrive, I'll acknowledge baby by name, which is vital. I often forget what mum and dad's names are, but even if this is their first baby, they're parents now. So I call them mum and dad. So we'll capture photographs of baby in Moses basket being held by mum, being held by dad, sometimes as siblings. Obviously, with the current situation with COVID, although it's improving greatly now in terms of people who are allowed into the hospital, most of the babies we've met in recent months have been solo. But sometimes there'll be extended family present. And an excellent device for including people is to actually ask mum and dad to bring up images of their other children, if they have them, or other family members on their phones, and put the phones with the baby and capture that as a way of including them.
We should never forget, really, that this is, and you certainly have proved that, really, in your memory and what you've been saying and why you set up the organisation, that this is the hardest moment for parents to face, this reality. And I do see pictures that are created that could so easily be of a child who hasn't passed, actually. And I'm struggling a bit for the words, but they are beautiful pictures. And perhaps I shouldn't feel ashamed of saying that. And I'm almost feeling, this typical British thing of saying, am I using the correct terminology here? How do you prepare, though, both a photographer and parent or parents for this meeting and this photographic moment? It's not something that you can just read about in a manual. It's not something, well, not that I've found anyway, that you can look up on YouTube. And I remember from my experience of photographing young Felix's funeral, nobody really was around to say, well, this is what you do and this is what you should expect and this is how you should act.
Well, quite. It is something that's new to many people. Losing a baby is new when it happens to a family. Sadly, some go through multiple losses. But this, yes, I suppose this is new. Although actually, it's not new. This isn't new. Victorians used to do this.
Yes,
there's a photographer called Todd Hochberg in Chicago who collects Victorian memento mori, photographs of deceased baby or a young child or even an adult taken when photography was still relatively new, when you would only have a photographer take your photograph for a special event. Yeah. And it's amazing to think now, whilst we're doing this digitally, over 100 years ago, new photographers were doing this with the new technology.
Yeah.
Then, so it's not actually a new idea. But in our training sessions, we will show examples of images. We're very fortunate that when we approach families, we ask them if we can use their images very gently. And we say limited consent means for training photographers and raising awareness with midwives and other health professionals, for example.
Yeah.
So it's a small audience. But it's really, really useful for us to be able to show new recruits the kind of images that they'll come across, the kind of images they're expected to capture, especially where sometimes baby will have blemishes, bruising, skin tears, malformations if baby's passed away because they've got a syndrome, Edwards syndrome, Patau syndrome. There's lots of reasons why babies pass away. A lot of them, you can't tell they've passed away because they just look like they're asleep.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. When I saw these pictures, I thought, my word,
Very often, the only clue is that the lips are a bit dark and there's a dark blush on the fingernails.
Right.
And those, we do lighten those a little in post-processing. But really, they just look asleep. And we talk to them as if they're asleep. This is a really simple device strategy for being less nervous and being less frightened, because it is quite scary. I didn't know that I could do this until I did it. I'd only seen my own deceased baby until I actually met a family and met their deceased baby. And it was weird because I was in the car park afterwards, punching the air, because it wasn't my grief, it wasn't my loss, it wasn't my pain. And I could keep it at arm's length to be able to give them this gift. All of the images that I see are captured with love and compassion and edited sensitively and with care for the parents.
And what about the parents? What's their feedback to you as an organisation? What do they say?
The feedback from families is such that we're absolutely getting this right. And this makes a difference. This makes a difference. One of our hashtags when we post on social media, hashtag making a difference, hashtag volunteers. The volunteers are amazing. We are nothing without our volunteers. And they really are incredible. Not just the volunteers, but their families who help support them. So other half looking after the children, for instance, for the volunteer to be able to go to the hospital, friends looking after their school run so that they can be available to go to the hospital, people giving them a lift. You know, the extended family of supporters for Remember My Baby is really helping our volunteers to meet the demand, which is an emotional one and can be challenging, as well as the technical one.
These are, as you've said to me, actually, prior to our conversation now, the only images a parent will have of their child. And the ones for me that touch me, as much as those featuring a parent holding their son or daughter, were the ones with siblings kissing foreheads and such strong, potent images like that. I would imagine a photographer comes away quite affected by these encounters. Is it too crass of me to suggest that they too may need a sense of counsel following these sessions? Do you provide that? Yes, we do. Because of the nature of this, some of our volunteers have been there and that's why they're involved. Other volunteers recognise the value of it. Perhaps they've not been touched by a loss of their own, but they may have been touched by the loss of someone close to them. Others just get it. They just completely get it. Why wouldn't I do this? Why wouldn't I do this? But it varies dramatically from one session to another, how it is in the room and how that touches the photographers. Very often, there's love in the room. There's even laughter in the room at times. And some of the things that we suggest photographers do to help distract the families from the grief of the situation is, so whose nose has he got? Gosh, hasn't he got long fingers? Does he take after mum with those? You know, this details that other people would mention in the normal way were that baby still alive. So this sense of normalcy that you talk about. Exactly. We've had comments from families that we've met. Families have actually said it was normalised. The photographer came in and was so kind and gentle with the baby, and it became normal. And that seems to bring comfort in itself. Obviously, midwives are dealing with this on a regular basis, yes, and they will call baby by name, etc. And we kind of followed their lead. But for us to come in to this situation and behave as if this is a normal situation, to us, it's a normal situation. We do come away with different emotions afterwards, depending on how it went, you know, and what kind of emotions the family were in at the time. We have a counsellor who will speak to volunteers if they wish, initially over the phone, and be able to signpost them to where they can find support if they feel the need. We encourage volunteers to chat to their colleagues within RMB, their peers and their regional coordinator who looks after the team, in areas around the UK. And of course, us co-founders and trustees are also available. One of our volunteers coined the phrase RMB duvet. Right. which I sometimes use in our group. I put hashtag RMB duvet deployed. Yeah. Because you go onto the group and you say, well, I met a family today who lost their little boy. We protect confidentiality, so we'll refer to babies by the initial letter. Yeah. So this volunteer, for instance, she said a few times, I've met this family and they lost baby T. I was able to spend about half an hour with them and capture the most amazing images. And, this was said and that was said. And they'll talk a little bit about their experience. And you might say, I had a little cry in the car park, or I was okay until I got home. And then I had a little moment while I got the kettle on and made a coffee and this sort of thing. And she said, because when a photographer posts of their experience in this way, you then get a collective hug from people in the group. Yeah. There's lots of likes and cares, obviously, on the Facebook, the reactions.
But also you get lots of people saying, oh, well done. Oh, gosh, I had one like that. Isn't it? It's tricky, isn't it, to know what to do and this sort of thing. So we share experiences and we support each other, and you get well done, lots of positive strokes. Yeah. And people say, oh, give me a bell if you want to chat, or drop me a message if you want to chat, or, so RMB duvet deployed.
That's a lovely way to put it. I know that you said that photographers don't have to be professional. Many of them are, I know, but they don't have to be. Is there? I'm trying not to be too clumsy with this question, but I'm wondering that there's a type of photographer, be that gender, be that age, whether they're a portrait photographer by trade. I wonder if there's a type of photographer that you typically see that says, I want to help here.
I think it's more a question of the type of person. The type of person who wants to be able to give back with the skills that they have, because we have photographers in their 20s, we have photographers in their 60s. Yeah. There might even be older ones. I don't ask their ages, but some of them are retired. We have men, we have women, we have people who've been through loss, people who've been touched by loss, people who have never been touched by loss at all of a baby, but just totally understand it, value the reason why we're doing this. We've got people from all walks of life, all backgrounds. And there doesn't seem to be a particular person. You need to be able to think on your feet, assess the light technically, assess the situation in terms of the emotion of the family, and be able to adapt your workflow depending on where baby is at the start. So being held, I'll start with being held. If baby's in the Moses basket, I'll start within the Moses basket. But whichever point I start at, there is a natural flow to capture the images that I want to capture. And also things in the room, the memory box, flowers that might have been sent, cards that may have been sent, this sort of thing, teddy bears, etc. So it's not really a particular genre. We've got award-winning wildlife photographers on our list.
Wow.
And they don't normally photograph people. And landscape photographers, we need people images to be able to assess their skills. So when someone applies, we do need images of people.
We make a living by what we get. We make a living by what we give. I watched your film and I was really moved by it. Those, I'm assuming, are words from a photographer, though that one was a non, and words from John Bunyan on your site too. You've not lived today until you've done something for someone who can never repay you. There's not a doubt in my mind that those who may tentatively start out end up with such enrichment for laudable and the right reasons, helping people. I would imagine that people who sort of tentatively step into it and think, what have I got myself into, end up with a very different feeling and emotion.
We are aware that there are several volunteers who have actually had their lives changed by the experience of volunteering for Remember My Baby.
I bet, yeah.
Which is fantastic. And they can't imagine not being involved. It's almost like they were, born to do it. And others come in and say, well, I'm not sure, but I'll have a go. I'll give you my best shot, which is all we can ask. We do have training and we do offer, where possible, which has been a bit limited through the COVID crisis, we do offer shadowing. So if the parents are amenable and there's room, sometimes the bereavement suites we visit are so small, there really isn't room for another person. But we try and offer shadowing. So a new recruit can go along with an experienced one and either watch the experienced photographer work and assist where necessary, or they can shoot under the direction of that experienced volunteer. And this can give a big boost to their confidence to go solo. But what's amazing is that they will step up to the challenge. As an absolute minimum, they'll get a detailed talk through of what to expect, especially if there's a known issue with the baby, such as a particular syndrome or whatever, or this baby's got Edwards syndrome, so this is what you can expect to see. We do try and give them a specific sort of description of what they can expect, depending on what gestation baby was born at, early losses, for example. So, yes, there's an awful lot of variety, and we try and give them as much support as we can. And also they get to see images. This is the important thing about families being willing to let us share images. Yeah. Even limited consent is incredibly useful so that we can actually show a family's images to a photographer where their baby had a particular thing. Anencephaly is where the brain doesn't form, which is usually covered by a hat. So we're able to actually say to a new volunteer, right, this is an anencephaly baby, unfortunately, that's passed away. This is the link and the password to a gallery. Have a look at these. This is one that's been photographed previously, which we're allowed to share with you. And that means they're not going in. We don't want them to go in and go,
No.
We don't want them to gasp when they see the baby. So this is why we ask, when someone phones, we ask, what's baby's condition visually?
I would imagine, I think the answer is going to be no immediately as soon as I ask this question. But do you have enough photographers?
No.
Absolutely
not.
Yeah. How short are you of the number that you practically need to make sure that everybody can be seen when a phone call is made?
I think practically we need to at least double our number.
Right. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Some areas we're very sparse and some areas we have none at all. North Wales, we have virtually none at all. Bangor Hospital is not served by any volunteers.
Wow.
Other areas are so busy. Obviously, London area is densely populated and there are a lot of hospitals in the London area. Volunteers travel into London a lot, but still we're short. We might not be able to manage to cover all the sessions we're asked to cover because we're too stretched. We're spread too thin.
Yeah.
We have had some volunteers through the COVID crisis who have quite rightfully stepped back because they're at risk. They're either shielding or isolating or in a bubble or whatever for themselves or for a family member, etc. Some of those have come back now that they're double jabbed. But yes, we're sparse in some areas and some areas are so busy, even though we've got a reasonable team, actually, we do get a lot of calls. In normal times, in the space of a year, we'll meet 1,000 families. That's 2 or 3 a day calling us.
Wow.
But the reality of child loss, baby loss, the reality of baby loss is that there are 14 or 15 losses a day. So we've got the tip of the iceberg here, really. Not everyone wants to use this service, and that's fine. Some of them take images of their own on their own camera or on their phone, and that's fine. But we want every family facing a loss to have the choice of high quality professional images.
From your experience, there will undoubtedly be photographers listening in other countries now, I know that, who may or may not have similar organisations. You mentioned an American one already. Or some people who may be thinking, well, I'd like to attempt to go about starting something like this. You're the perfect person to ask for advice on that.
Well, the American charity covers quite a few countries. They're doing very well in the Republic of Ireland, for example.
Good.
We sometimes liaise if someone's close to the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So the American charity covers quite a few countries. In Australia and New Zealand, they have a similar organisation called Heartfelt. And there's another charity in the Netherlands. Also, there's a charity slightly different in this country, Butterfly Wishes Network, will actually do the same thing, but for families where a child has a terminal or life-limiting illness.
Right.
And occasionally, there's a grey area as to whether a baby is under RMB's remit or Butterfly Wishes remit. You know, so we work quite closely with Butterfly Wishes from time to time to make sure that a family can have images. And again, beautiful images. Some of our volunteers also volunteer for Butterfly Wishes. I mean, it's not a new idea. This was done in Victorian times. There are several charities around the globe that actually provide this. Remember My Baby is the only dedicated charity to providing this service across the whole of the UK.
Yeah.
So we need to build up the network of volunteers and we need to build up the network of hospitals so that every family can have this choice. And we won't stop until we're there.
I'm bound to ask, because you've been out and photographed many times yourself, clearly. Is there a moment or type of moment that sticks most vividly in your mind that you can say, Nicky, this is what makes this whole thing worthwhile?
I think the one that springs to mind is a mum who was quite young. She was only in her early 20s. She'd lost this little baby, and it could have been my daughter losing a baby. I was old enough to be her mum, and I sort of came over all maternal at the time. And I don't normally become emotional in a session. I managed to keep a lid on it because it's not my grief, it's not my loss, not my pain, and I can shelve it and be sad later. But I try and be professional at the time, you know. Having said that, if a tear escapes, it shows that we're human, and that's fine. That's completely fine. But this one family, I came across mum again at an event. We have in our local crematorium garden of remembrance, we have a baby garden, which is looked after by the local SANS group. And it's a beautiful garden. And they have events through the year, especially at Christmas, for example, where people can go and remember their babies. And you're with people who understand completely your situation and your emotions. And I was approaching this event at the tail end of the event to just say hello to a couple of people in the charity. And this mum that I'd met, who was the sort of same age as my eldest, came towards me, and our eyes met. She was just leaving. Our eyes met. And there was a moment of recognition where we looked at each other and both went, oh yeah. And then we didn't say a word. We just embraced. We just had a little moment on the path.
Yeah.
And she didn't need to say anything because it was written all over her face. You know, and I was so pleased that she has those images to remember her baby by, and she went along to this event run by Derby Sands at this beautiful garden, and we just had that little, I'm welling up now, we just had that little moment of shared understanding, you know, because I'd been there. I knew where she was in her journey, you know. This is what makes it worthwhile. This is why I say about it being the silver lining in my stillbirth cloud. I wouldn't wish baby loss on anyone because it's devastating. And we're all members of a club none of us want to join. None of us expect to join. But actually, you meet the most amazing people. You really do meet the most amazing people. You know, I wish I'd never had this reason to meet them, but I do have lifelong friends as a result of being part of the baby loss community, however much I would rather I wasn't in there. There's a particular kind of knowing look, if you like, about what we're going through collectively as well as individually.
And my thanks to Nicky Heppenstall. And all my guests today, Nancy Borowick and Lynzy Billing, Susan Goldberg and Gary Williams, I know, for a minute or two with the challenge. And this has been a week about extraordinary women. That's what the episode has been about this week. A very special PS to come, actually. A PS with a bit of difference. I'd like to play you as a play-out song, though, today, before that postscript. A song by an artist who I've featured a reasonable amount. I really like the voice of Maya Isakovich, and I wanted, since we were having a week delving into the archive, I thought let me go searching in the archive for songs that I've played that I think would suit the mood of this particular program. This song is called Soul Changing. Back with a PS in a moment.
My eyes are wide open. I see you clear. My toes touch the same floor our world has been shaking on. Oh, what's your soul saying? Oh, is your world changing? Oh, what's your soul saying? Oh, is your world changing? Your face tells me always things your mouth often spares, and I hope you know I do what it takes to bring joy into your day. Oh, what's your soul saying? Oh, is your world changing? Oh, what's your soul saying? Oh, is your world changing? Oh, my eyes are wide open. I see you clear. My toes touch the same floor
a song called Soul Changing. It's by Maya Isakovic, today's Play Out song. I hope you've enjoyed today's special. As I said, specials all the way through September. Specials for all. Oh, yes, please. Mine's a mojito, not that kind of special. Because next week I'm speaking with guests who I've had the pleasure to walk and talk with. I know most of my guests, 90% of guests, will be recorded via Zoom, really. That's the main way in which I managed to speak with fantastic photographers and creatives from around the world. But I've also had the good fortune to walk with some photographers. And that's what next week's show is about, when I delve into the archive once more. Right, a PS. Today, a PS from another extraordinary woman who read poetry to us earlier this week. An archaeologist, a museum curator, a broadcaster, an ethnologist, and more latterly, photographer. Now, Kate O'Neill McCulloch came in to read us some poetry and talk about her life, which has taken a twist in terms of health. But I'm not going to let that story, the health story, define Kate's work. Because her poetry, she's really only recently started and published her first book of poetry, which is in parts shaped by the languages and traditions of her Highland and Irish upbringings, and by her work as an archaeologist and ethnologist throughout the Highlands and Islands. Look, I tell you what, I'll leave you a link to this book and Kate's work. But I'd like to finish by playing a poem to you that she read to us. It's a poem well, it's called Irish. It's an evocative ode to her parents when they were younger, and I think it's a beautiful poem. And I'd like to end this week's show about extraordinary women with this extraordinarily beautiful reading of that poem called Irish.
Irish. The Roundhouse, Camden, 1965. Picture my parents, staring from a crowd of faces, drift batter, washed up from the small sea between destitution and diaspora, uncertain in all their young beauty. My mother, her marigold hair coiled like spooled dulse, for she has still to unlearn the Atlantic, the salt of her parents' dailiness, casual rotations of the Angelus and soda loaves. My father, brill cream, sleek and sweet handsome. He has yet to learn the meek lowering of his neck, an abattoir calf muted to the mauling of his Irishness, never his own name in the squall, Paddy, Mick, scattering him winnowed chaff. But tonight they dance full giddy miracles. Tomorrow and every evening after, he will peel the potatoes she prepares for him, turn each perfect planet upon his fork, let their heavy skins and the spoils of each day spiral from him. He'll dip these treasures in unction of butter, gold, panned from a dish printed with the prettiness of daisies, all their meadowed sweetness, and my mother anointing him.
The Photowalk is a Loading Zone production.